April 9th, 1241, at daybreak. Duke Henry II of Silesia led his forces out through the gates of Legnica. His army followed, with the open expanse of Wahlstatt stretching before them. Somewhere beyond this field lay an enemy that had already devastated half of Poland. As he rode through the city, he paused briefly at the Church of St. Mary. A masonry brick then dislodged from the roof and narrowly missed him. His steed remained unfazed, yet the onlookers fell silent, interpreting this event as a dire prophecy. They were correct. On that particular morning, Henry possessed certain knowledge. He was aware that the Mongols had already razed Lublin, plundered Sandomierz, and reduced Krakow to ashes on Palm Sunday. He knew they had swept through his own capital, Wrocław, and that he had allowed it. He had purposely abandoned the city to gain enough time to assemble his men at Legnica for a final stand. However, he also held a piece of information that should have instilled hope. His brother-in-law, King Wenceslas I of Bohemia, was on his way to meet him with a full army of 50,000 soldiers, just one day's march distant. What Henry did not fully grasp was that the Mongols had already anticipated this. They knew of Wenceslas, his exact proximity, and they had already made their decisive move. Henry was destined to perish that very day before his reinforcements could arrive. By the time the sun set on April 9th, Henry's severed head would be paraded on a spear around the walls of Legnica. 9 sacks would be filled with the ears of the deceased, and a route from the smoldering ruins of Poland, extending all the way to Vienna and beyond, would lie terrifyingly unobstructed. This was the Battle of Legnica. While it wasn't the largest battle of the Mongol invasion of Europe, nor the most strategically complex, it held immense importance due to the events that nearly unfolded next. Europe came perilously close to ceasing to exist as we know it, saved by a single fatality and a fortuitous miscalculation of timing. I intend to demonstrate how they directed the most formidable military force in the medieval era straight into the heart of European civilization, how they executed their trap, and how one particular morning in April 1241 almost completely reshaped history. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, indeed the entire trajectory of the Western world, all hung precariously in the balance, symbolized by a falling brick from a church roof. Let us begin. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 was not merely a raid or an opportunistic act of plunder. It was a meticulously planned campaign, years in the making, founded on intelligence gathered across an entire continent and executed with a level of precision that still unnerves modern military historians. The mastermind behind this was Subutai, a name you are likely familiar with, arguably the greatest military strategist of the medieval world. It's crucial to understand that Subutai's approach to Europe wasn't a spontaneous assault. For years before a single Mongol horse crossed the Carpathians, he dispatched spies into Poland, Hungary, and Austria. He was intimately aware of the political rivalries among European rulers, the animosity between various kingdoms, the fragmented nature of the Polish duchies, the distrust between the Polish and Hungarian courts, and the slow, cumbersome manner in which European armies typically mobilized and moved. His entire strategy was constructed around these insights. Let me vividly depict Subutai's intelligence operation, as this aspect is often superficially addressed in most accounts. The Mongol Empire in the early 13th century possessed a systematic empire-wide intelligence apparatus, a capability unmatched by any European kingdom. When Subutai resolved to invade Europe, he didn't simply ride westward to discover what lay ahead. Years in advance, he sent agents, merchants, travelers, diplomats, individuals who could traverse European cities without arousing suspicion. These were not casual observers. They were operatives who lived among Europeans, mastered their languages, studied their military structures, noted army movements, assessed the response times of rulers to threats, and identified which lords were trustworthy and which would hesitate to aid their neighbors. The information they provided was extraordinarily detailed. Subutai knew that Poland had been fractured since 1138, lacking any unified command. He understood that the relationship between Poland and Hungary was so complex that a coordinated military response would be sluggish. He was aware that Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was embroiled in a political struggle with Pope Gregory IX, making him reluctant to commit forces to any external conflict. He also recognized that the Cuman people, a Turkic steppe group who had recently sought refuge in Hungary, represented a point of political tension between Hungary and the Mongols, which could serve as a pretense for invasion. He didn't blunder into Europe. He had meticulously charted it out before ever making a move. Here is how his plan unfolded when Subutai finally enacted it. 3 massive army groups. The main military contingent, comprising roughly 65,000 soldiers under Batukan and Subutai, was slated to advance southward through the Carpathian Mountains directly into Hungary. This constituted their primary objective. The expansive, verdant Pannonian Plain offered ideal conditions for sustaining the Mongol forces and could potentially serve as a permanent western outpost for subsequent expansion. Hungary's conquest was non-negotiable. Yet to ensure a secure approach to Hungary, Subutai needed to prevent any external intervention. Poland, Bohemia, and the German states were potential threats. If any of these entities managed to merge their forces and march south, they posed a risk to Batu's northern flank during the Hungarian campaign. Such an eventuality had to be averted. Consequently, a secondary, smaller contingent was dispatched northward into Poland. Its purpose was not permanent occupation, but rather to devastate the region, obliterating all military capabilities. The aim was to keep Poland's leaders and their allied nations so preoccupied with reacting and suffering losses that no soldier could be spared to aid Hungary. This northern division, numbering approximately 10,000 to 20,000 troops, commanded by Princes Orda Khan Bar and Kadan, invaded Polish territory from the east in late 1240, executing a swift and merciless advance. Speed was their ultimate weapon. Polish defenders were constantly bewildered about the Mongols' next target. Before a unified response could be organized, the Mongols had already relocated. The systematic nature of their actions warrants a step-by-step examination. It was calculated execution, not random destruction. Sutesk was razed, Lublin plundered, and Sanders faced a siege. It surrendered on February 13th, followed by a massacre of its inhabitants. This served as a stark illustration of the consequences of submission under these circumstances. The Polish voye attempted to halt their progress on February 13th at Tusko, but was decisively defeated. Another Polish army, reinforced with units from Kov and Sanders, confronted them at Smolnik on March 18th, suffering another crushing defeat that sparked widespread panic throughout the remaining Polish cities. Kov, the regional capital and one of Poland's most significant cities, was abandoned in fear by its populace before the Mongols even arrived. The Mongols captured and set fire to it on March 24th. Within 6 weeks, the Mongols had systematically dismantled every major military presence in southern Poland. This was not due to overwhelming numerical superiority, which they lacked, but because each Polish force fought in isolation, while others were still in the process of organizing. Subutai had meticulously orchestrated this outcome from the outset. He foresaw the Poles' inability to unite in time. He calibrated the campaign's tempo to ensure they could not. Hitting various targets with such rapidity prevented any force from reorienting to reinforce another before the Mongols had already moved on. Bar and Kadan then turned their attention towards Wrocław, the Silesian capital. Duke Henry II had retreated there to consolidate his remaining forces. He had also urgently pleaded for assistance from the military orders in the north and west, to sympathetic German nobility, and, crucially, to his brother-in-law in Bohemia. He implored them, "Bring your army. Come now. We need you." Weslaus was en route with 50,000 soldiers and was nearing their position. The Mongol commanders received intelligence regarding this development, leading to the decision that made April 9th inevitable. They lifted their siege of Wrocław and departed. Not because the city had triumphed over them, it was barely holding on, with its inhabitants having deliberately incinerated portions of the city to deny resources to the attackers. They left because they faced a more pressing concern. They had to intercept Henry before Weslaus's arrival. Should these two armies converge, Henry's forces augmented by 50,000 Bohemians, the Mongols would be severely outmatched. Their objective was to neutralize Poland, not to become entangled in a prolonged siege or to engage a massive coalition army in a pitched battle of their opponent's choosing. They needed to eliminate Henry swiftly and efficiently, then keep Weslaus in a defensive posture to safeguard the northern flank of the Hungarian campaign. They tracked Henry southeast to Lika, to a flat, open expanse outside the city, a place that would later be known as Wallstatt. In Middle High German, this word translates to battlefield. The name was ascribed later, but even before hostilities began, that field had already earned it. Before delving into the battle itself, it's essential to grasp the stark realities of what confronted each other on that field. The two armies at Legnica were not merely tactically and culturally distinct. They differed in every fundamental aspect imaginable: their philosophies, their training, and their very understanding of warfare. Comprehending this profound contrast is crucial to making sense of the battle. At this historical juncture, Henry II stood as the most influential lord in southern Poland. Although his title was Duke of Silesia, his true influence extended across multiple fractured Polish duchies, achieved through a combination of strategic marital alliances, land grants to German settlers who stimulated local economies, and astute political mediation among rival noble factions. He had been systematically working towards something Poland desperately required: unification. In 1241, Poland existed not as a single, cohesive realm, but as a fragmented collection of territories. This fragmentation originated in 1138, when Duke Boleslav III, through his will, partitioned his lands among his sons, a decision that cast a long shadow over the nation for more than a century. The consequence was a mosaic of rival duchies, plagued by incessant internal conflicts and lacking a unified military command capable of rallying national resources against external threats. Henry stood as the closest approximation to a unifying figure Poland possessed. He held the necessary prestige, wealth, and most crucially, the political acumen to maintain a semblance of cohesion among competing factions. Historians have posited, with considerable persuasiveness, that had Henry survived and been granted another decade to consolidate his power, Poland might have achieved unification a full century earlier than it ultimately did. However, that additional decade was denied him. It is insightful to consider Henry II's character beyond his military role. His epithet, the Pious, offers a glimpse into how his contemporaries viewed him, not merely as a warlord king, but as a devout Christian ruler who earnestly embraced his religious and moral duties. His mother, Saint Hedwig of Silesia, would later be canonized in 1267. His father, Henry I, the Bearded, dedicated his reign to integrating German settlers into Silesia and fostering the region's economic growth. Henry II inherited a sophisticated duchy and a political heritage that set him apart, positioning him as more than just one of many Polish magnates vying for authority. In essence, he was the kind of leader destined for historical significance, yet he was fated to perish on a battlefield within his own duchy before midday. On the morning of April 9th, Henry commanded an army that was, to be frank, a desperate assemblage. It comprised his Silesian knights, his most formidable troops, well-equipped heavy cavalry, seasoned by collective training and proficient in coordinated combat. He also had cavalry contingents from Greater Poland and from the Duchy of Opole, led by Mieszko II. Furthermore, the survivors and remnants of two armies that had already suffered defeats at Tursko and Chemelnik joined his ranks. These were men who had previously confronted the Mongols and been vanquished, now standing on this field with a grim understanding of the impending doom. His forces also included conscripted peasants from across his domains, unfamiliar with serious warfare, as well as Bavarian miners and Moravian knights. This was a coalition hastily gathered from whatever resources were available within the limited time frame. And he had the Knights Templar. It's important to be precise on this point, as popular historical narratives often exaggerate their involvement, distorting the true picture. The Templar contribution at Legnica was indeed real, but it constituted a small contingent. The most meticulous modern historical analyses estimate their actual fighting strength at approximately 68 to 88 soldiers, specifically 3 brother knights, 2 sergeants, and around 500 estate workers and support personnel who accompanied them. They were highly trained and well-equipped, representing the apex of their order, but they were not an army. They were a compact, exceptionally skilled unit, integrated into a much larger, more diverse force. The Teutonic Knights frequently feature prominently in many popular accounts of this battle, typically depicted as a substantial contingent of elite German crusaders fighting alongside Henry. Modern scholarship has considerably complicated this perspective. Evidence suggesting their significant presence at Legnica largely originates from Jan Długos's 15th-century chronicle, penned more than 200 years after the conflict. Historians examining this text have observed that references to the Teutonic Knights may have been interpolated after Długos initially completed his work. The Hospitallers are in a similarly ambiguous position. Neither the letter dispatched by the Templar Grand Master to the French king, nor Jan Długos's earlier mentions include them. The most truthful stance, supported by the latest thorough scholarship, is that the only military order confirmed with certainty at Legnica is the Templars. Henry organized his available forces into 4 distinct squadrons. His own Silesians and the Templars formed the primary unit under his direct command. Sulislaw led the cavalry from Greater Poland. Mieszko II commanded the Opole troops. Boleslaw of Moravia directed the remaining contingents, which included the Bavarian miners and various infantry units. And then he waited one more day. Now consider the opposing side. The Mongol army, by most serious estimations, was actually numerically smaller than the European force it confronted. Contemporary accounts, such as Historia Tartarorum, indicate the initial Polish invasion detachment numbered approximately 10,000 men. By April, after the preceding engagements at Tursko and Chemelnik, that force had likely dwindled to around 8,000. 8,000 against Henry's force of somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000. On paper, in a conventional medieval battle, Henry should have triumphed. But this engagement would not be conventional, and the Mongols understood that. Henry, however, did not. Every single one of the 8,000 Mongol warriors was an exclusively cavalry archer, unlike a knight who possessed archery skills alongside other fighting methods. These mounted archers had been honing their unique skill set since they were toddlers able to ride. Their composite recurve bows, crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew under tension, could propel arrows with lethal force over distances that made European longbows seem modest in comparison. The horsemen wielding these formidable weapons were skilled enough to hit moving targets at full gallop and could even shoot backward over their horses' hindquarters while riding at speed, a maneuver famously known as the Parthian shot. Their sustained rate of fire in combat was unmatched by any European archer. Furthermore, each of these 8,000 men operated within a command and communication infrastructure that was remarkably sophisticated for the 13th century. The Mongols employed an intricate system of colored flag signals, allowing commanders to transmit precise directives over vast distances in real time, bypassing the delays inherent with messengers. The overall battle commander would routinely position themselves on the highest available ground at the start of each engagement, overseeing the entire field and adapting to unfolding developments. They would then issue precise orders through the flag relay chain to unit commanders, who executed them with practiced autonomy. This particular aspect often strikes military historians who delve deeply into the subject. The Mongol system wasn't just tactically superior. It operated on a fundamentally different plane of organizational complexity compared to anything prevalent in Europe. In 1241, European armies largely communicated through shouting, limited visual signals over short ranges, and officers physically riding to specific locations to deliver orders. Consequently, command decisions trailed battlefield events by minutes, sometimes critically so. This meant, in essence, that European commanders reacted to circumstances, whereas Mongol commanders actively shaped them. Meanwhile, Henry's army adhered to the established European military conventions. Knights, perceiving opportunities, would charge. Infantry followed, engaging as best they could. If cavalry became separated from infantry, it was a problem requiring immediate resolution through individual bravery and skill. There was no real-time battlefield coordination. Instead, there was valor, honor, the sheer impact of steel, and the kinetic shock of a heavy cavalry charge, which was genuinely devastating against foes who hadn't discovered a countermeasure. The Mongols, however, had discovered one. They had been neutralizing such charges for 2 decades across campaigns in China, Central Asia, Persia, and Russia. They had refined this technique to a state of automatic, habitual, and unhesitating execution, which was now about to be deployed again precisely on schedule. Let's examine this battle in its chronological sequence. What transpired at Legnica on April 9, 1241, transcends a mere recounting of medieval violence. It serves as a masterclass in military psychology, the art of maneuvering an adversary into self-destruction, turning their own presumptions, training, and ingrained notions of what battle entails into the very weapon that defeats them. The Mongol Tactical Handbook featured a signature opening move, deployed in nearly every major confrontation: the Mangudai. This term is familiar to anyone conversant with Mongol military history. Light cavalry, swift, minimally armored, and designed for speed and agility rather than the raw impact of a European heavy knight, would advance toward the enemy line. They would engage in an exchange of arrows, absorb some incoming fire, and then abruptly turn and retreat. The crucial descriptor here is feigned. They were not genuinely withdrawing, they were simulating a retreat. The Mangudai units were specifically chosen and trained for this role. The psychological demands were stringent. One had to ride towards a dangerous foe, endure their incoming attacks, and then turn one's back, galloping away, with absolute faith that comrades would flawlessly execute the subsequent phase of the scheme, and that the enemy would pursue exactly to the intended location. This required the kind of practiced discipline and unit cohesion that only years of collective training can foster. The sham retreat was meticulously paced, not too fast, lest they vanish over the horizon immediately, prompting the enemy to halt and regroup instead of fully committing to a chase. Yet not too slow, as lingering within striking distance could allow pursuing cavalry to actually catch and engage them before the trap was fully sprung. The Mangudai had to maintain just enough distance to keep their pursuers relentlessly chasing without the pursuit ever developing into direct contact. This was an extraordinarily difficult feat to achieve under combat conditions, yet the Mongols had practiced it until it was as instinctive as breathing. Herein lies the complementary aspect that rendered this strategy effective, particularly against European knights. The ingrained customs of medieval chivalric combat made immobility an unthinkable option when confronting a fleeing foe. Knights instinctively charged. It was the foundational element of their military ethos. The charge transcended mere tactics. It embodied their very identity, their honor, and the essence of knighthood. And when successful, a heavy cavalry charge was an irresistible force. Masses of steel-clad warriors and powerful steeds, moving at full speed, could decimate any infantry line and overwhelm lighter cavalry attempting resistance. The critical flaw, however, was that this maneuver only worked upon impact. If it failed to connect, its momentum dispersed harmlessly, and the Mongol forces were exceptionally adept at creating precisely the void where such a charge was intended to land. Beyond that, for a European knight witnessing the enemy retreat, to halt the pursuit felt like an act of cowardice, a squandered opportunity for victory, a betrayal of every principle his training and culture had instilled about a warrior's duty. The psychological imperative to charge was immense. It wasn't foolishness that propelled Henry's cavalry after the Mongol detachment. It was a profound, deeply embedded set of values and behaviors, so thoroughly internalized that overcoming them amidst the fervor of battle, while observing armed adversaries seemingly fleeing in disarray, proved almost impossible. Subutai had deciphered this characteristic of European knights years prior to the Battle of Legnica. He had observed them at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, 18 years earlier, where a combined Rus and Cuman army had pursued seemingly routing Mongols for 9 days across the steppe before being annihilated. This initial lesson had undergone 18 years of refinement. The battle commenced with the Mongol vanguard advancing towards Henry's lines. The Silesian cavalry, under Henry's direct command, initiated contact. A brief, fierce engagement ensued. Arrows, some close-quarters fighting, intense pressure, and then the Mongols withdrew. Henry's cavalry immediately gave chase. The Greater Poland cavalry, led by Sulislaw, followed suit. Subsequently, the Opole cavalry under Mieszko joined in. One by one, Henry's horsemen peeled away from their main formation, committed to the pursuit, and surged forward, convinced they were routing a collapsing enemy. Meanwhile, the infantry, the conscripted peasants, the less agile units, were left behind, watching the cavalry vanish, waiting. This was the precise moment Henry sealed his defeat, though he remained unaware of it. What unfolded next represents one of the most remarkable tactical elements of the entire engagement, and it is a frequently discussed aspect among serious historical scholars of this battle. As Henry's cavalry pressed forward in pursuit of the Mongols, a dense smoke screen enveloped the battlefield. Contemporary accounts vividly and consistently describe it. A thick, deliberately generated smoke that segregated the advancing cavalry from the remaining infantry. The exact method is subject to debate. Some sources suggest special devices designed for this purpose, materials that produced heavy, obscuring smoke rather than open flames. Others propose that fire arrows ignited strategic positions. What remains undisputed, and what the sources unanimously confirm, is the outcome. The cavalry and the infantry could no longer perceive each other. The European army had been effectively bisected by the smoke. Consider the simultaneous impact this had on both halves. The cavalry at the forefront, Henry's elite knights, the Templars, the Greater Poland horsemen, were now chasing a retreating enemy with no visibility to their rear. They had lost sight of their infantry. They were unaware if it was following, holding its ground, or breaking. They were fully committed to the pursuit with no means of communicating with the units they had left behind. The infantry in the rear, the conscripts, the less mobile formations, the men who had been awaiting orders, suddenly found themselves unable to witness the events unfolding ahead. They could hear it, horses screaming, the sounds of combat, but from what direction? How close? Was the cavalry triumphant, or had something gone awry? Should they advance into the smoke, maintain their position, or flee? And then, an event occurred that has captivated historians for centuries. Through the smoke, a voice cried out in Polish, "Uciekajcie, run, flee." The Polish chronicler Jan Długos, writing in the 15th century, over 2 centuries after the battle, specifically recounts this detail. Mongol soldiers shouting panic-inducing commands in Polish through the smokescreen to sow disorder among the rear elements of the formation. Whether Długos's account is entirely factual, or if this detail evolved into a narrative explaining the ensuing chaos in hindsight, we cannot definitively ascertain from this historical distance. What we can affirm is that the chaos itself is corroborated by multiple sources. Furthermore, the notion of Mongols having Polish-speaking individuals within their ranks is not improbable. They had been operating in Polish territory for months. They had accumulated captives and enlisted auxiliary troops from the subjugated populations throughout their military endeavors, and gathering intelligence had been a cornerstone of their planning for this entire undertaking. However, what I find most compelling about the smoke and the shouts, irrespective of the exact method, is how it illuminates the Mongols' profound understanding of warfare, transcending mere tactical considerations. Their objective wasn't simply to eradicate Henry's forces, it was to dismantle them before their destruction. They grasped that a medieval army was more than just a collection of armed men. It represented a social construct founded on trust, hierarchy, transparency, and a mutual comprehension of events. Their strategy involved obliterating visibility, disseminating misinformation, and creating a chasm between what soldiers could perceive and the reality unfolding. Once the psychological framework crumbled, the physical eradication would inevitably follow. The smokescreen and the vociferous commands weren't incidental to their military maneuvers. They were the military maneuvers. Arrows and cavalry strikes arrived subsequently. The psychological breakdown came first. As Henry's knights plunged deep into pursuit, scattered, out of formation, separated from their infantry by the obscuring smoke, and rapidly heading in the direction the Mongol had led them, the Mongol strategy advanced to its next stage. Mongol light cavalry, which had remained on the flanks outside the initial skirmish, now swept inwards. They assailed the isolated European infantry simultaneously from both sides. This wasn't a head-on charge. That wasn't their modus operandi. They attacked as mounted archers, maintaining constant motion and distance, raining arrows into the infantry formation from angles that offered no effective defense. Medieval infantry was designed to withstand a frontal assault, not to counter swift-moving cavalry archers engaging both flanks concurrently. As the smokescreen thwarted any cohesive response or repositioning, the infantry began to unravel. Meanwhile, the knights who had pursued the Mongol found themselves deep within enemy territory, and the dynamics of their surroundings had drastically shifted. The men they had been chasing had ceased their retreat. Other Mongol cavalry, previously held in reserve, materialized on the flanks. Archers continually engaged them from distances where the heavily armed European cavalry couldn't effectively retaliate. Their weaponry, armor, and entire tactical design were geared for close-quarters combat, not for confronting agile mounted archers who refused to approach within lance range. The knights' charge, their ultimate weapon, the very skill they had honed their entire lives, had been expended in a futile chase. Now, they were vulnerable targets on unfamiliar terrain, encircled on multiple sides, devoid of infantry support, and with an unclear grasp of their own command structure. Some contemporary narratives suggest that the Mongols also deployed rudimentary gunpowder-based armaments at some juncture during the 1241 European campaign, possibly incendiary devices or rockets. This technology had been assimilated through their conquests of Chinese and Central Asian territories. Whether these were specifically utilized at Legnica or in other engagements during the campaign remains genuinely ambiguous from the surviving records. However, the psychological impact of fire, smoke, and peculiar weapons on soldiers already embroiled in disarray, already cut off from their commanders, already uncertain of events, should not be underestimated when attempting to reconstruct the experience from an insider's perspective. Then, the Mongol heavy cavalry moved in for the decisive blow, a final assault that simultaneously struck the trapped knights and the disintegrating infantry in a synchronized movement, completing the encirclement. I urge you to pause here and contemplate the experience of the European commanders, those who were still alive, those who could still perceive anything, at this critical juncture. Your cavalry has vanished. Somewhere within and beyond the smoke, your infantry is being assailed from both sides by archers you cannot engage. Someone has been shouting, "Run!" in your native tongue, and now heavy cavalry is bearing down on you from the front. This is not merely a military defeat, which entails fighting and subsequently losing. This is an entirely different phenomenon, a deliberate demolition of the psychological framework that underpinned the army's functionality. The Mongols didn't just vanquish Henry's forces, they systematically dismantled them, layer by layer, severing command, denying vision, inducing panic, collapsing flanks, and then delivering the coup de grace. By the time the heavy cavalry made contact, there was no organized resistance left. When the engagement concluded, Henry's army had ceased to exist as a viable fighting force. The Silesian Knights, the Greater Poland cavalry, the survivors from Tursko and Srem, who had stood their ground on this field, aware they were outmatched but stood nonetheless, were gone. The Templar formation, comprising the most formidable soldiers within the European contingent, suffered near total annihilation. The infantry lines crumbled. Henry himself made an attempt to escape. Historical records indicate he was mounted, clad in full armor, and moving swiftly. Nevertheless, it was insufficient. He was captured, then killed, and subsequently decapitated. His severed head was affixed atop a spear. The Mongols then advanced towards the city walls of Legnica, the very city Henry had departed from that morning, where the falling brick had narrowly missed him. There, they paraded his head along the perimeter, displaying it for the inhabitants within to behold. This act was purposeful, strategically designed to instill a singular, profound realization in all those observing from the ramparts, that the conflict was utterly concluded, that all resistance was futile, and that the leader upon whom they had relied was no more. In adherence to Mongol tradition following significant victories, the deceased were catalogued by severing an ear from each body. Accounts detail 9 substantial sacks filled with these ears. 9 sacks. Just a day's march away, 50,000 Bohemians were stationed. On that day, King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia received news of Henry's demise. He commanded an army of 50,000 soldiers, representing the largest singular military force in the region. He promptly reversed course and retreated to Bohemia. This decision cannot be entirely faulted. I believe it's essential to consider his rationale rather than simply dismissing it as an act of cowardice. Wenceslaus arrived in the area to discover that the army he was intended to reinforce had ceased to function as a cohesive unit. He possessed no detailed intelligence regarding the current strength of the Mongol forces, their numbers, precise positioning, whether they had sustained significant losses at Legnica or remained at full capacity. He had no allied command to coordinate with. No prepared defensive fortifications existed in that vicinity. What he did possess was a substantial army, an uncertain tactical landscape, and the very recent and stark example of Henry II, an experienced and respected commander with a prepared defensive posture, being obliterated within hours. To remain in the open, hoping 50,000 soldiers would suffice, was not an obviously sound choice. The Mongols dispatched a small contingent in pursuit, far too small to engage 50,000 Bohemians in a direct confrontation. However, it was sufficient to shadow them, test their flanks, and ensure Wenceslaus understood that any attempt to rally and reorganize would be met with opposition. It achieved its objective. The Bohemian army withdrew to fortified positions within its own territory and remained there, effectively eliminating any significant organized military presence in the region, capable of challenging the Mongol position in Poland or advancing towards Hungary from the north. The northern front was secured, and from Subutai's perspective, the Polish campaign had achieved all its intended goals. Every major Polish military unit had been neutralized. The largest potential Allied army, Wenceslaus's Bohemians, had been rendered ineffective without a direct engagement. The diversion had proven entirely successful. Subutai then redirected his full attention southward. On April 11, 1241, 2 days after Legnica, occurred the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River in Hungary. While Bidar and Khadan conducted their diversionary campaign through Poland, burning Kozla and annihilating Henry's coalition at Legnica, the primary Mongol force, commanded by Batu Khan and Subutai, had already traversed the Carpathians and penetrated deep into Hungarian territory. King Bela IV had assembled a considerable army. Estimates range broadly from 60,000 to as many as 100,000 men, including Allied contingents, and had established a fortified encampment on the western bank of the Sajo River near the village of Mohi, with the river safeguarding his eastern flank and a bridge serving as the principal crossing point. Subutai utterly crushed them. I will offer a concise overview here, as Mohi merits a dedicated in-depth analysis which will be presented in a future episode. Do subscribe if you wish to be informed when it's released. Nonetheless, The essence of the events reveals volumes about the exceptional caliber of the strategist behind them. Subutai discovered an alternative river crossing downstream, out of sight from the Hungarian camp. He dispatched his forces across under the cover of darkness, with the main body approaching the bridge at Mohi while the flanking maneuver silently completed further south. At the bridge, Hungarian crossbowmen contested the passage. Yet the Mongols deployed catapults, wheeling artillery, a technology the Hungarians had no defense against, to clear the opposing bank. The crossing was successfully forced. The flanking movement was completed. The Hungarian camp now faced simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Then, Subutai executed a maneuver that appears counterintuitive until his strategic rationale is understood. He deliberately left the visible gap in the Mongol encirclement, an apparent escape route, clearly perceptible to the Hungarians under immense pressure. The Hungarians seized this opportunity. A deluge of men streamed through the opening, fleeing into the open countryside instead of maintaining their defensive stance and engaging in combat, and the Mongols, who had deliberately created that gap, were primed for them. They pursued the escaping Hungarians into the exposed terrain, systematically eliminating them. Cavalry archers relentlessly hunted down scattered infantry and horsemen across extensive stretches of open ground. Contemporary narratives recount bodies strewn over a distance that would have necessitated 2 days of travel. 2 archbishops and 3 bishops perished at Mohi. The Hungarian military apparatus, the principal organized fighting force of one of medieval Europe's most influential kingdoms, was effectively annihilated within a single night and morning. Bela IV narrowly escaped, eventually reaching the Adriatic coast by vessel and sailing to safety. The Mongols pursued him across Hungary with a detachment, but he managed to stay one step ahead of them for several months. Within 48 hours, from April 9th to April 11th, the Mongols had crippled the military capabilities of 2 major European kingdoms simultaneously, deploying separate armies operating hundreds of miles apart with synchronized timing to prevent any mutual aid. This was the master plan conceived by Subutai. It represented the entire strategic architecture of the 1241 campaign. Poland was never the primary objective. Hungary was. Poland served as the barrier that needed to be removed to open the path to Hungary, and both barriers had been breached in the same weekend. Now, envision yourself in Western Europe in mid-April 1241, looking eastward. There is effectively nothing separating the Mongol army on the Hungarian plain from Vienna. Vienna possesses fortifications, but lacks an army to challenge the Mongols beyond its walls. Beyond Vienna, the German states are in disarray, exchanging frantic correspondence, debating whether this is divine retribution, contemplating organizing a crusade, and struggling to assemble any cohesive military response. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who might have led such an intervention, remains engrossed in his dispute with the papacy, a political conflict that had occupied his attention for years, and which he had no intention of abandoning simply because horsemen were ravaging Hungary. Pope Gregory IX wrote letters. Frederick II wrote letters. Templar Grand Master Pons d'Aubon penned a letter to St. Louis of France detailing the casualties at Legnica. The message circulating through European courts was not that the Mongols had merely won a battle, but rather, "We don't know how to stop them, and we're not sure anyone can." Meanwhile, in Hungary in the spring of 1241, Subutai, a 65-year-old commander with over 4 decades of continuous warfare experience, was discussing the next phase of the operation with Batu Khan. The strategy involved a winter invasion, targeting Germany first, likely during the 1242 or 1243 campaign season, and then extending further. The Mongols referred to the Atlantic Ocean as the Great Sea, and this concept was not merely metaphorical, it was operational. The military leaders crafting these plans had, in the preceding 12 months, obliterated every army that had confronted them across a vast expanse of Eastern and Central Europe. They had legitimate grounds to believe this pattern would persist. This question consistently bothers me whenever I analyze this material, as the military rationale in late 1241 was undeniably clear: continue pushing westward. The Mongols possessed momentum, superior organization, a proven operational system, and no credible opposition ahead of them. European resistance had been decisively broken at Legnica and Mohi. The political landscape of Western Europe was fragmented and lacked initiative. Yet they halted and retreated. They occupied Hungary for approximately a year, conducted some additional incursions into Austria and Croatia, and then withdrew eastward. Why? There are three principal explanations for this. They are interconnected and each carries varying degrees of significance, yet none individually provides a complete answer. I intend to meticulously examine each one, as this is where history transcends mere storytelling and becomes a genuine intellectual enigma. On December 11, 1241, the great Khan Ögedei died in Karakorum. He was Genghis Khan's third son and designated successor, the individual who had authorized and funded the entire Western campaign, serving as the political core around which the Mongol Empire was structured. His death triggered a binding obligation within Mongol imperial law that was essentially non-negotiable. Every prominent member of the royal lineage, every prince with a claim or interest in the succession, and every senior commander with political stakes in who would become the next great Khan. All were compelled to return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the formal assembly convened to determine the succession. Batu Khan was a grandson of Genghis through his eldest son Jochi. The question of Ögedei's successor held immense implications for Batu's own standing and the political status of his branch of the family. His connections with certain other Genghis princes, especially Guyuk and another grandson rumored to be his personal foe, were sufficiently hostile that his non-participation in the succession might lead to political changes. In 1241, there was no indication that the Mongol operational framework had reached its limits when confronting European forces. What ultimately stalled their advance was internal Mongol politics. Batu departed, and Subutai himself passed away in 1248 without ever re-entering Europe. The specific blend of resolve, authority, and tactical brilliance that defined the 1241 campaign never coalesced again. This particular aspect of the historical account is, in my view, crucial for clear comprehension, as it molds our interpretation of subsequent events. There exists a narrative, sometimes stated directly, sometimes merely hinted at, suggesting that Europe successfully defended itself in 1241. In this version, the Mongols supposedly encountered an insurmountable military obstacle, discovered their own limitations, and realized that Western civilization was either too resilient or too well organized to be conquered. This account is reassuring, implying that the outcome was legitimately earned, and that survival stemmed from particular qualities of European civilization that made it defensible. However, the evidence does not support this perspective. The Mongols achieved victories at Legnica and Mohi. Subsequently, they conducted raids into Austria and Croatia with minimal opposition. When they returned to Poland in 1259 under Barandai, they executed another successful raid, again facing no significant resistance. The reasons why the Atlantic remained untouched. Germany was never invaded, and Paris never witnessed Mongol cavalry at its outskirts, are a combination of logistical constraints, the death of a great Khan, and the subsequent political fragmentation among the Mongol succession. Europe did not halt the Mongols. The Mongols themselves ceased their advance due to factors entirely rooted in their own imperial politics. This is the unvarnished truth, unsettling though it may be, and I believe you deserve this truth more than a comforting fabrication. Let me present a scenario that I frequently revisit, as it vividly illustrates the true stakes involved. What if Henry had chosen to remain within Legnica's walls? What if, when that brick fell from St. Mary's roof, he had interpreted it as the ominous sign everyone around him believed it to be, and decided, I will stay. Westlaus is only a day away. We will wait behind these defenses. The Mongols' primary strategic objective at Legnica was to defeat Henry before Wenceslas's arrival. This was the entire operational logic behind their approach. Abandon the Wrocław siege, move swiftly, and engage Henry before the two forces could unite. Had Henry refused to emerge, the Mongol detachment would have faced a truly unfavorable set of choices. They could have besieged a fortified city with a 50,000-man relief army rapidly approaching, or they could have withdrawn, allowing Henry and Wenceslas to combine into a force capable of threatening the Hungarian campaign's northern flank. Neither option aligned with their mission. The battle might never have occurred, or it might have transpired under conditions far less advantageous for the Mongols. Would this have entirely altered the outcome? Probably not completely. Subutai would likely still have found a way to reach Hungary, and very likely would have emerged victorious there, regardless of events in Poland. Ogedei was still destined to die in December, ensuring the subsequent withdrawal. However, the devastation to Poland would have been less severe. Henry would have survived, and the political endeavor he championed, Polish unification, the consolidation of the scattered Piast duchies into a cohesive entity, would have had a chance to continue. Polish unification actually took place in 1320, nearly 80 years after Legnica. This delay, according to historians specializing in this period, is largely attributable to the destruction of Henry's vision and the power vacuum created by his demise. One morning, 80 years, history pivoting on the edge of a brick. The Mongols did not remain in Poland. After Legnica, having dispatched a detachment to monitor the retreating Bohemian army and confirm it wasn't regrouping, Bidar and Kadaň divided their forces into raiding parties. They spent weeks traversing the Silesian countryside, seizing what they could, before heading south through the Carpathians to rejoin the main army in Hungary. They never returned for Legnica Castle. The castle endured. They never formally occupied the duchy or attempted to establish any Mongol administrative framework. Yet, the repercussions of April 9, 1241, potentially radiated through Polish history for generations, influencing the very map of Europe we see today. Henry II, known as the Pious, was the most viable candidate Poland had produced in over a century for genuine national unification. His father, Henry I, the Bearded, had devoted his reign to establishing Silesia as the dominant Polish duchy, fostering its economy through land grants to German settlers, reinforcing administrative structures, and solidifying Silesia's position as the wealthiest and most efficiently organized of the Polish successor states. Henry II inherited this foundation and continued to expand upon it, employing strategic marriages, diplomatic mediation among rival Piast branches, and careful development of his duchy's economic base to broaden his political influence. He was far more than just a military commander who happened to be present on the wrong battlefield. He embodied a political ideology in motion, an ideology extinguished alongside him at Wallstatt. His demise severed the recently mended fractures within the region, causing them to widen and deepen once more. Competing factions of the Piast dynasty vied for power. Silesia, weakened by the destruction of its military elite and scarred by Mongol devastation, gradually relinquished its dominant role in Polish affairs, a position Henry had meticulously cultivated. The subsequent serious contender for unification, Przemysl II, was crowned King of Poland in 1295, 54 years after Legnica, only to be assassinated the following year. Władysław I ultimately achieved genuine unification, crowned in 1320. From 1241 to 1320, a span of 79 years, nearly 8 decades, Poland endured persistent disunity, internal strife, and political aimlessness. Polish historians largely attribute this prolonged period to the fall of one individual on that fateful morning in Silesia. The psychological impact of the 1241 invasion on medieval European society was profound and enduring, influencing tangible realities beyond mere sentiment. The Tartars, the European term for the Mongols, a word Europeans believed echoed Tartarus, the Greek underworld, deeming it appropriately infernal, became a source of profound existential dread in European consciousness for generations following 1241. This was not simply a metaphor. Peruse the correspondence from European courts in the months and years after Legnica and Mohi, examine the papal letters, review the chronicles. The prevailing tone isn't that of individuals recovering from a military setback and strategizing a counterattack. Rather, it reflects people who had encountered something utterly beyond the comprehension and descriptive capabilities of their established worldview. European rulers understood how to conceptualize other Christian kingdoms, Muslim armies, and the myriad threats the continent had faced within living memory. They possessed no framework for understanding an adversary that appeared without warning, moved with incomprehensible speed, obliterated everything in its path without hindrance, and then simply vanished. The letter from the Templar Grand Master to St. Louis, dispatched after Legnica, detailing the losses and cautioning about what seemed imminent, stands as one of the most striking documents of this era. 3 brother knights, 2 sergeants, 500 men. The tone is not military reporting, it verges on witness testimony. This pervasive fear subsequently reshaped Europe's construction. Following 1241, investment in the construction of stone fortifications markedly escalated across Poland, Hungary, and the German borderlands. The crucial military lesson from Legnica, avoid open-field pitched battles against them, as you will certainly lose, was not assimilated into European tactical doctrine for another century. European armies continued their traditional charges for generations. However, the architectural lesson resonated profoundly. Walls, stone, elevation, depth, physical barriers the Mongols could not simply bypass with speed. The raids, however, persisted. Burundai successfully led a Mongol incursion into Poland in 1259 and 1260, largely traversing the country unhindered and departing with significant spoils. Tulabuga and Nogai Khan returned in 1287 with an even larger force, including vassal troops from Ruthenia. Although this raid proved less successful, each return reinforced the pervasive fear, kept the memory vibrant, and prevented Wallstatt from receding into comfortably distant history. There's a specific long-term consequence of 1241 that I wish to highlight directly, as I believe its significance is often underestimated and crucial for understanding the world we inhabit today. The Mongol invasions did not impact all of Europe uniformly. Poland was assaulted, traumatized, and its political development significantly impeded. Yet Poland remained outside direct Mongol political control. It was not governed by the Golden Horde. The Russian principalities to the east, however, were not as fortunate. Kievan Rus had been annihilated in the years leading up to 1241. Kiev itself was reduced from a major city to mere rubble, with only a few hundred survivors. The surviving Russian principalities functioned as tributaries of the Golden Horde, a status they maintained for roughly the subsequent 2 centuries. 2 centuries of Mongol suzerainty, 2 centuries where political culture, administrative practices, and the relationship between rulers and ruled were molded by the demands and assumptions of Mongol imperial governance. Historians debate precisely the extent to which this shaped Russian political development in the long run. The degree to which autocratic tendencies in Russian statecraft are specifically attributable to the Mongol period versus other influences remains a genuine academic point of contention. However, the fundamental reality is undisputed. Poland and Western Europe progressed through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries along one developmental path, while Russia traversed a distinct one. The critical divergence in this trajectory can be traced directly back to 1241. Let's now broaden our perspective significantly, because a pivotal question, in my view, among the most profound counterfactuals in human history, is embedded within the events at Legnica. Imagine the world if the Mongol advance had continued unabated. This isn't merely academic conjecture, it holds immense, palpable consequences. By 1241, Western Europe found itself at a unique and crucial juncture in its evolutionary path. The foundational elements of what we now recognize as contemporary Western civilization were being laid, albeit gradually and imperfectly, in ways not immediately apparent at the time. The University of Paris was already a hub, nurturing the scholastic philosophical tradition that would ultimately lay the intellectual groundwork for scientific inquiry. At Oxford, Roger Bacon was developing his experimental method, a concept that would profoundly influence future generations of thinkers. In Naples, a teenage Thomas Aquinas was just 15 years from embarking on the work that would define Catholic philosophical theology for centuries. European cities were experiencing an economic resurgence, fostering the growth of merchant culture, the gradual evolution of contractual legal frameworks, and the nascent institutional structures that would eventually give rise to modern banking and commercial law. None of this was predetermined. Each component relied on specific conditions: the physical survival of urban centers and institutions, the continuous preservation of accumulated written knowledge, and the endurance of social structures conducive to intellectual and commercial development. Disrupt these conditions sufficiently, and progress wouldn't just slow, it would halt entirely, even reverse. The Mongol invasions dramatically disrupted these conditions. In every territory they conquered, the immediate aftermath was a demographic collapse of a truly staggering magnitude. Poland suffered a loss of between a quarter to a third of its populace during the 1241 invasion. While estimates vary by region and calculation method, no credible historian places the figure below 20%. Hungary saw up to half its population perish during the year-long occupation following Mohi. Kievan Rus, just pre-1241, had been decimated, transformed from one of medieval Europe's premier urban centers into a wasteland of ash and bones. These aren't losses from which a civilization recovers in a single decade. These are multi-generational scars. Poland's demographic recovery from the 1241 invasion took decades. Hungary's recovery was even more protracted. The regions of Russia most impacted by the 1237 to 1240 campaign still show discernible population gaps in historical records centuries later. Now, project this scenario westward, into Germany, France, the Rhineland, the Loire Valley, and northern Italy, where the financial and commercial infrastructure of medieval European civilization was concentrated. Some historians contend that the Mongols, as rulers, were not solely destructive. The Pax Mongolica of the late 13th century was indeed a reality. This period of Mongol imperial stability facilitated unprecedented movement of people, goods, and ideas across Eurasia via secure trade routes connecting East Asia to the Mediterranean. Certain regions experienced economic revitalization and cultural exchange after the initial devastation. However, this argument presupposes Western Europe's submission. I genuinely cannot envision a scenario where this occurs without catastrophic, prolonged resistance. Medieval Western European identity was deeply intertwined with Christendom as a sacred endeavor, with a warrior aristocracy steeped in values of honor and defiance, and with a papacy that would undoubtedly have called for crusades, demanding a fight to the very last. The conquest of Western Europe would not have resembled the relatively swift subjugation of the Russian principalities. It would have unfolded as years of relentless city-by-city, castle-by-castle destruction. The institutional fabric, the universities, the monasteries safeguarding written knowledge, the urban commercial networks would not have emerged from such a process unscathed. Whatever, if anything, survived would certainly not have been the civilization that gave birth to the Renaissance. It would have been something utterly unrecognizable. I frequently return to the idea of the precariousness, the terrifying narrowness of the margin. Wesleyos I was spared by a single day. Ogaday died in December. Henry made his fateful decision at the gates of Legnica on the morning of April 9th. Any of these events could have unfolded differently. Altering any one of them significantly would have shifted the entire progression, causing history to diverge. We exist in one particular branch of an event tree that had numerous other potential trajectories, and our current branch was contingent upon a specific set of coincidences. If you've joined me for 70 minutes reliving 1241 today, you now grasp the profound significance of this battle. Not solely for its tactical brilliance, though it possessed that too. Its significance doesn't stem from its scope, which was actually quite modest compared to Mohi, but rather from the fundamental question it raises. How precarious is human civilization? How fine is the line separating the present reality from a drastically different potential future? The truthful answer is exceedingly fine, finer than we generally prefer to acknowledge. If this kind of profound historical exploration, which not only recounts events but compels reflection on their enduring relevance, resonates with you, then please consider subscribing. Seriously, every new subscriber enables the continuation of this in-depth work. And if this content provided you with value, a quick like would be greatly appreciated. It takes mere seconds and genuinely benefits the channel because there's more to come. Mohi is the next topic, Subutai's strategic masterpiece. Following that, we'll delve into the Golden Horde, the decades of Mongol rule, and the divergent historical paths it forged for those parts of Europe that succumbed and those that did not. The Battle of Legnica is memorialized on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw today. Among the numerous conflicts etched onto that monument, and there are many, given Poland's turbulent past, the entry for Legnica simply states, Legnica, April 9, 1241. No further explanation, no descriptive text, just a date and a location. I believe this conciseness is perfectly suitable. Sometimes, the true weight of an event needs no embellishment. Here is the thought I wish to convey to you. Legnica wasn't the place where Europe was ultimately preserved. It was the place where Europe very nearly wasn't preserved. The Mongols achieved a decisive, brutal, and efficient victory. Henry, a truly influential historical figure, a man in the midst of establishing something substantial, something that could have altered the course of an entire nation by a century, was killed and decapitated before midday on a spring morning. The forces assembled to repel the invasion were effectively annihilated. The route westward lay open. The subsequent major offensive was already being planned. What ultimately halted their advance was not superior European military tactics. It was not divine intervention. It was not the bravery of the Silesian knights or the defenses of Legnica Castle, or indeed anything Western civilization accomplished, constructed, or decided. It was a deceased man in Karakorum. The internal power struggles for succession within an empire, combined with the logistical challenges faced by an army that had been fighting for many years across an immense distance from its homeland. That is the unvarnished truth. I recognize that a more comforting narrative exists, the one where courage triumphs, civilization earns its survival, and people find solace and meaning in that version. However, the evidence does not support it, and I believe that if you are here, having dedicated your time to this material, you are seeking the authentic account, not the sanitized one. Henry sensed it when that brick collapsed. He felt the vulnerability, yet he rode into battle regardless, because what other choice was there? He was the Duke of Silesia. His people were suffering. His army awaited his command. His entire existence had been building towards this critical juncture. He made his decision. History made its own. And it is somewhere between these two elements, between the choice an individual makes and the random chance that dictates its cost, that Legnica resides. That is its enduring significance. That is why it is etched on a wall in Warsaw. And that is why 800 years later, we are still here discussing a spring morning when everything almost came to an end. If you found this worthwhile, and I trust you did, please leave a like, share your most impactful takeaway in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the Mohi episode.